today I'll be presenting to you the corporate perspective in achieving net zero emissions target. I'm the managing consultant of South Pole and in the agricultural value chains team. And my background is in palm oil production. I did my PhD at Unilever, and we published a paper on greenhouse gas footprints of agricultural crops of palm oil in Indonesia. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I think these are really already very well covered by the previous two speakers, so I will speed up on this part. Globally, there's a huge problem about climate change, and the United Nations scientists have actually indicated we have only 10 years to cut global greenhouse gas emissions before reaching the point of no return. And looking at Indonesia itself, Indonesia's emissions rose by more than 250% between 1990 to now, with the highest increase being the energy sector. And the government's climate target of 29% below business as usual in 2030 is not currently in line with 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. And the emissions for 2019 are estimated at 3.4% of the world total. Next slide, please. And in terms of within Indonesia, land use and land use change, forestry and agriculture are one of the highest emissions contributors to the GHG emissions. And that's why the palm oil sector in Indonesia is also under a lot of scrutiny because of this, because there's a lot of news about forest fires and pressure on the palm oil companies in this area because of that. Next slide, please. So in terms of net zero definition, I think we already know it means any emissions are balanced by absorbing an equivalent amount from the atmosphere. So in order to meet the 1.5 degree global warming target in the Paris Agreement, global carbon emissions must reach net zero around mid-century. And for companies, next slide, please. For companies itself, this is a very important point because there are really various stakeholders that are demanding actions from companies. As the previous two speakers already mentioned, both Indonesia and Malaysia have their own climate targets, and companies that are resting within the countries, Indonesia and Malaysia, they have a role to play to contribute to the government's climate target as well. And for companies itself, they have also other stakeholders that are giving them pressure. This includes the trade partners, which 49% of world's GDP is actually covered by net zero targets. And for shareholders, 54% trillion of assets managed by investors are actually in the Climate Action 100 Fund. So it means that investors are also increasingly concerned about the climate impacts of their investments. So companies are increasingly pressured to also set net zero commitments so that the investors would also be investing in green or sustainable impact investments. And for employees and customers, 87% of employees said that businesses should take a public position on social issues relevant to their business. And 73% of millennials would spend more for sustainable products. So I think this is also very much related to the EU's current initiative to have more sustainable products labeling, and this would also impact a lot on the palm oil companies in Indonesia and Malaysia because I believe a large proportion is supplied to the EU as well. Next slide, please. So in terms of company net zero commitments is growing really rapidly, and just currently the APEC region is still there's less commitment relative to the Europe and the US, but if the APEC region net zero commitments are also growing, we have really increasing number of clients coming to us and say that they want to commit to net zero because they have a COP27 commitment as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in terms of net zero commitments by corporates, you'll see some familiar names on this slide as well. And as you know, because to achieve net zero for companies, you need to be net zero by scope 1, 2, and 3. And for the scope 3s of a lot of these multinational large FMCG or FMB companies, their upstream purchase goods and services are the palm oil from Indonesia and Malaysia. So these companies are as you all know, like they will be pressuring the Indonesia and Malaysia companies, palm oil companies, to reduce or achieve net zero in order for these FMCG companies themselves to also reduce their own supply chain emissions. Next slide, please. So what is a credible corporate net zero target? It means to achieve global net zero emissions with ambitious reductions across all scopes. So it's very important that in the near term, the emissions of the company is being reduced as much as possible and in alignment with the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario before any residual emissions are actually offset or by carbon removals technologies or carbon removals offsets. Next slide, please. So in terms of what are the key elements of the science-based targets net zero standard, so as you can see from this diagram, there's a need to reduce the overall emissions as much as possible within the short-term or the near-term period, which is 5 to 10 years. And by 2050 at the latest, there's a need to achieve net zero. That means neutralizing any residual emissions at 2050. Next slide, please. Yeah, so in terms for the palm oil sector, for the science-based target setting and also science-based targets net zero setting, the SBTI actually came up with the flag sector guidance. I think the public consultation just came out recently. And within this SBTI flag target, palm oil is actually one of the commodity pathways that have been indicated. So in the future, all the companies in the palm oil sector will be able to use this SBTI flag sector guidance to actually set targets for the reduction of emissions related to palm oil production. Next slide, please. So there are 5 main step approach to set SBTI. So I would go through each of them quickly. And the first one is to, next slide, please. The first one is to select the base year. So for this selection of base year, the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions should be accurate and verifiable. And the base year emissions should be representative of a company's typical GHG profile. And this base year should not go earlier than 2015 because we want, or the SBTI would like to have the companies to be forward-looking in terms of their reduction, so that the base year should be a year that is maybe your latest reporting year, for example. Next slide, please. And once the company selected a base year, they should calculate the greenhouse gas emissions in accordance with the GHG protocol, which is also the standard that is globally applicable and also aligned with the science-based targets as well. Yeah, next slide, please. And then the next point is to set emissions inventory boundary, because for the science-based targets, there are actually 2 ways to set scope 3 emissions targets. You can set 67 of the minimum coverage of the scope 3 emissions, or you can go up to 90% minimum coverage for the long-term targets. For the scope 1 and 2, you have to have at least 95% minimum coverage for both the short-term and the long-term targets. Next slide, please. And then after you have set the base year and then you have calculated your emissions and also chosen your boundary for the setting target, you should choose a target year. And the near-term targets, as we said before, it should have a target year of 5 to 10 years from the date of submission to the SBTI. And for the long-term targets, it must have a target year of 2050 or sooner. Yeah, next slide, please. And finally, we can follow the Science-Based Targets Initiative approach to calculate the necessary reductions to achieve net zero. So there are 2 main approaches. For the absolute contraction, it basically means to reduce the emissions by a set percentage each year. And while for the sectoral decarbonization approach, you follow the guidelines that are specific to your sector. And currently, as mentioned before, the new flag sector guidance will be applicable to the palm oil companies. Okay, next slide, please. Yeah, so there are various ways to set the science-based targets. As mentioned before, there's absolute contraction, the physical intensity or economic intensity. There's also the supplier engagement target. So if you're in the palm oil sector, you can imagine the supplier engagement target would be more applicable for your downstream companies. So for example, the global FMCG companies like Nestle, Unilever, they might be working with suppliers in the upstream, or the palm oil companies like yourself, to actually set this supplier engagement target together. Next slide, please. So I think I've come to the end of the presentation in terms of the corporate perspective. I'll hand over back to Thomas to moderate the session. Thank you.